Okay, I think we're going to get started. It is about 2 minutes after 10, and I want to thank all of you for joining us for this really important webinar. We have an all-star panel of experts who are going to weigh in on the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic is having on the restaurant industry right now. We have about an hour. We're going to speak to each one of our panelists individually, and then we're also going to open it up for Q&A. Our editor-in-chief, Heather Risky, is going to be feeding me questions live during the conversation. And so we have about an hour. So I'm going to dive right in with introductions. We have Bob Bonney. He is the CEO of the Missouri Restaurant Association. Gerard Kraft, he's the co-owner of Niche Restaurant Group. We have Chris Ford. He's the Senior Vice President of Fortune Financial Corporation. Tom Risky, he is principal at Carmody McDonald. And then we also have Dr. Peter Baumgarten. He is the Professor of Practice, Strategy, and Organization at the Olin Business School at WashU. So we're going to start off with Bob. And as the CEO of the Missouri Restaurant Association, you work very extensively on laws, regulations. So could you give us kind of a 1,000-foot view of what's going on with Congress and on a state level for the restaurant industry right now?
Sure. Thanks for allowing me to be part of this, by the way. I look back in March 11, is a little over 60 days ago, and the first time I really got a glimpse of what this might look like as far as the coronavirus was when I heard the NBA had suspended its season. And then shortly after that, other sports leagues followed. I got a call from my grandchildren saying they didn't have to go back to school after spring break was over. And from there, it seemed like the news came so quick and so fast, and all of it was bad. And it turned a great industry completely upside down. Dining rooms closed. The industry has lost 3 decades of jobs. Employment in the restaurant sector is as low as it was in 1989. 2 of 3 restaurant workers are now furloughed or out of work. And we've lost more jobs, 3 times more than any other industry. The decline in sales is about $80 billion. So through the CARES Act, Congress through a lifeline with the Paycheck Protection Program loans, also the economic injury disaster loans. We advised our members, as well as non, to apply for both, which many of them did. Unfortunately, not everyone was able to get a loan. More unfortunate, though, was once you had the Paycheck Protection loan and the guidance was implemented, you found that at a time when restaurants were ordered to close, the Paycheck Protection loan was not going to be the lifeline that the industry needed. And we are working closely with the SBA and the Treasury Department to use their de minimis authority that was granted them in the Act to give restaurants more time to meet the payroll requirements that are a part of the Paycheck Protection loan forgiveness. We think that's only reasonable. What we're asking for is give us a period of weeks, perhaps as many as 24, after restaurants are open without restriction, so that these loans can be forgiven, can function as a grant, which is what was the clear intent of Congress in the Act. So we worked with through the governor's office. At this time, the Capitol began to close up. And so to get things done by legislation was not going to be an option. So we worked with Governor Parsons' office on some things that we thought would help restaurants. One was the state unemployment tax contribution rate, so that restaurants would not, or other businesses would not have their rate adjusted upward for layoffs as a result of COVID-19. We were able to get the ability to sell unprepared food and groceries from restaurants. Anything we could think of to help a restaurant offset the sales that it used to do. Restaurants, when their dining room was closed, many pivoted as fast as they could, as nimbly as they could, to carry out to delivery in enhanced ways. And I think by and large, there was some success there, but still sales were off 25 to 30%. There were about 25 to 30% of what normal looks like for a restaurant. And the lifeblood of any business is cash flow. And that lifeblood was severely restricted. And then we worked with the governor to issue an executive order that gave the ability to sell mixed drinks to go, as is the law in many other states. That expires June 15th. We are working today, last day of session, but we won't give up until they gavel out the legislation to make that permanent. Our survey said that 3/4 of diners who ordered carryout would appreciate that. And restaurants tell us that it is a meaningful source of income for them. When restaurants reopen, and by the way, some are still closed, as we know, in St. Louis City and St. Louis County. And they're into their 8-week period where they have to restore their payroll and their business is still closed. They're in 6 or 7 weeks, some of them. And I found out that there were restaurateurs working with their members of the Missouri legislature on that alcohol to go issue also. So we were happy we were able to get that done. We need to make it permanent because I do think it is a lifeline. So pivot to what we're doing now, in addition to trying to get favorable guidance from the SBA and Treasury on the Paycheck Protection loans. In conjunction with our partner, the National Restaurant Association, we sent a blueprint for success to Congress, and we have been speaking with legislators about that. What it is, and first of all, let me step back and say why it's important. In our mind, the size of the restaurant industry, you cannot restore the state economy or the national economy if restaurants don't reemerge successfully from this. And we believe that these talented professionals in the restaurant industry in Missouri and the nation will find a way to make it work. We can provide the funds they need to get to the other side of the pandemic. Restaurants are important because the economic impact of restaurants is larger than hotels and lodging, grocery and beverage stores, airlines, and spectator sports combined.
Wow.
It's larger than the oil and gas industry and agriculture combined. So we can't fix the economy if we don't fix the operating environment for restaurants. So what we're asking for is in our blueprint for recovery is a restaurant industry relief fund, much like was created for the airlines after 9/11, $240 billion in grants to help restaurants reemerge. And we're already making some traction on fixing the structure of the Paycheck Protection loans to replenish those, so those are available to those who received one to apply for another if they are getting in line behind ones who didn't get one in the first go round, to restore the 10-year loan terms that the CARES Act called for, tax credits or grants for restaurants to transition, to retrofit their dining room so that there can be more social distancing, to do other things that encourage the dining public to see restaurants as a safe place to be, which we think they are. We believe that and we've talked many times about this, that you can control a lot more of the environment of a customer in a restaurant than you can a large retailer or a grocer or a building supply store. You can eliminate the number of items that multiple people touch. You can double down on cleaning and safety. We published the Missouri Restaurant Commitment, which asks customers to step up their cleaning protocols and sanitizing. And we issued some guidelines after the governor issued his reopening plan, Show Me Strong Missouri, which we think is a favorable and a balanced way for restaurants to reemerge. We asked for Congress to consider the relief programs that provide food for citizens that need help with that, to allow those benefits to be used for meal kits from restaurants or prepared meals to go that can be offered by a restaurant at a very attractive price point, and all people could enjoy delicious restaurant food at home. And we asked for an increase in the emergency income disaster loans. Again, going back to the cash flow that's going to be needed to carry restaurants to the other side.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot going on kind of on the legislative side. So I want to turn to Gerard. You have been operating restaurants for over a decade, and you have a number of different restaurants in different formats, including one in a hotel. Can you kind of give us a sense of what's happening from a restaurateur's perspective? I mean, especially with the state or with the city, St. Louis County, reopening on Monday?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, just to touch on what everybody already knows, but, so many restaurants shut down. Some have pivoted to curbside pickup. We have 4 of our 7 restaurants that are doing some form of curbside at this point, but in limited capacity. Cat, I don't know if we were talking yesterday, but I think our restaurant group right now to date is 40% down from last year. So representing around $2 million down in sales, and the year has kind of just started. And even with curbside to go, I think even our best place is operating down 65% from last year, and that's our most successful to go operation. So I mean, this stuff is like peanuts. Again, I use it all the time, but I mean, it's a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. It really is. It's barely slowing the bleeding down. And the PPP loan and everything that goes on with that. I think everybody was really just kind of waiting and trying to kind of figure out what all the guidance from the SBA would be, and from the Treasury, and all these things were kind of leaking out day by day. And it's kind of crazy because we were expected to take these loans without even knowing what the terms were, and figuring out what the terms were as we were going. I mean, I think people are still trying to figure out those terms, to be honest. Within the past few days, we got new guidance. And so we ended up actually, yesterday was the last day that you could, I say, safely give back your loan if it wasn't going to work for you, which we did because we wanted to be able to do the employee retention credit, and that was the only way you could do it. So we had to gamble. I mean, we had to throw dice here and say that we're going to give this back, even though NRA, things like that, are kind of talking to try to push those terms back to make that PPP usable. So honestly, at this point, even if they did, we've given ours back, and we just had to gamble that the government was going to fail us again, and kind of go from there. But for us, it didn't work because we couldn't bring all of our staff back in time. And honestly, the way that they were making us bring our staff back was really kind of messed up. They wanted us to pretty much rip all of our employees off of their good unemployment terms that they're getting right now, bring them back onto our payroll, which is not a bad thing. I mean, they would be getting paid full wages, but then most likely fire the majority of them again at the end of the 2 months because we still wouldn't be back to full capacity. Opening at 25% capacity for anybody who can kind of just wrap their head around it, just to make it easy. Sardella has about 40 seats. If it were to reopen, it would reopen with 10 seats. So, I mean, imagine trying to turn a profit in a restaurant with 10 seats that, you know, wasn't charging thousands of dollars a person. So, I mean, those restaurants for now won't even open because it's just not, we're better off just keeping those closed for right now and kind of waiting it out.
Did you work with the city of St. Louis on the reopening guidelines?
I did, yeah.
Overview?
What's that?
Can you give us an overview of what those guidelines are and what you're going to be doing, what the experience is going to be like on the restaurant side and the customer side?
Yeah, and so for the restaurants that we have that will reopen at some point, they're not going to reopen next week when we're allowed to, but you know, sometime in June, hopefully, just depending on what we see, although we're seeing some pretty scary things in other states. So, you know, everybody will be way more spaced out. You know, you're gonna have guests arriving with masks. They'll be able to take them off at the table. You know, all of our employees will have masks. You know, there's going to be pay stations and things like that, so that, you know, we limit the contact. I think we're still even trying to kind of work out what those ordering scenarios are. It's going to be, you know, like an apocalyptic looking dining experience, you know, and I think, you know, the best thing that we can do is to give people warmth through that food and try to restore them in that way. But it's going to be, you know, it's going to take some adjusting, for sure. I think it was you who even said, like, we got to teach people to look at people wearing masks, you know, like it's a safe thing and not a scary thing. So.
Yeah. I mean, can you also, one of the things that you and I talked about was how important it is that restaurant owners, bar owners, that they like stick with these guidelines, you know, even a week or two in, when it kind of maybe seems like everything's okay, because can you talk about that?
Yeah. You know, and anybody who will listen, friends and, you know, in different interviews, I've been kind of preaching this, that, you know, if I can't connect with you by telling you that more people are going to die, if we don't take this seriously, if we don't, you know, properly execute this, if we allow our bars to become overrun with people or restaurants, if we get greedy and see a busy Saturday night, and I say greedy, it sounds so bad, but like, I know everybody's hurting. I know we all need the cash. But you know, if we take advantage of this busy rush and just kind of pack our dining rooms, don't pay attention to social distancing, don't pay attention to taking your employees' temperatures, don't space your employees out. If we fail to do all of those things, not only will people get hurt, get sick, but if we all reopen and go through all this effort to get our restaurants reopened and then have to shut down again, we're dead. This industry as we know it is going to be annihilated. And I think it's already taking such a big hit that we really, really can't afford to take another one. And so that's like my plea to everybody is, and I see the pictures out there on Twitter, Instagram, you know, there are a lot of people who aren't taking it seriously, and it's you know, for our families, but it's terrifying, but for our restaurant economy, it's terrifying.
Yeah. Okay. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn the conversation to Chris. Chris, you obviously Senior Vice President of Fortune Financial Corporation, but you also are a landlord. And I want to talk to you, when you and I had a chance to connect, we were talking about how to approach conversations with landlords and also with banks to be proactive rather than reactive. Can you give words of wisdom?
Yeah, it's an interesting position. Our owner is a local developer, and So as this whole process was unveiling itself, we're on the phone with tenants. I work with them on both the real estate and the bank side. So we're trying to navigate with several of those are restaurants. And for us as a community bank and as landlords, we have to have restaurants survive, or the community is not going to survive. That's where our business meetings are, friendships are made, families gather together. Without it, I think you have a pretty depressed and like Bob and Gerard said, the economy can't continue on. So in approaching the landlord ways, we talk with our tenants. We want to work with them. So if it's rather defer rent, we're also talking with our banks as we have mortgages on our properties, and just trying to come to terms on both sides. But from the tenants we talk to, we are working with them. We're offering, reduced rent through this time if we need to defer it, to make sure these restaurants can make it through. We understand that we're better off in the long run for that. From the bank side, the PPP loan process, I think, was intended to be a great thing. From the early stages before they passed the bill, you're constantly hearing Congress talk about not the 75%, 25% rule, as they understand restaurants and a lot of other industries have these huge overhead costs with operating costs outside of their employees. And while we didn't understand how long this might last, I think it was important to make sure that they got away from that. So I think it was 2 days ago, you saw the Inspector General's office, who oversees the SBA and Congress, going back and forth with each other on that it was not intended to be the 75-25. And I think they're now, I saw, proposing a 16-week instead of the 8-week spending period. So hopefully they get that done. From my personal opinion, from the bank side, a lot of these people are 6 weeks through. So unless they allow these people to reapply, the damage is already done. So we're going to need to see another program specific for restaurants to have them make it through this. So that's from a community bank side, that's what we're hoping to see. We're trying to work with local businesses as well to offer interest only and working capital loans. You're seeing some people take the PPP loan as a working capital loan. I think that's pretty dangerous given the payback period of 2 years instead of 10 years like they intended it to be. So hopefully we get some clarification on that as well. But most important thing, if we can be of assistance, we want to be there on the front end of it to offer those loans that reduce the rates that work for the restaurant owners, because 2 years is pretty quick payback for any industry. So hopefully we get some guidance on that.
So you also mentioned kind of getting ahead of the crisis. So how should someone approach their bank? Do you write a letter? Do you request a meeting? I mean, can you give some just advice on how to approach those conversations?
Yeah, the benefit of a bank of our size, we're small, we're local, our shareholders are local business owners. You pick the phone up and you call, and we understand through this process that so many people had trouble getting a hold of their banks, and that's a shame. But I think there's many banks in St. Louis, small community banks. There's the regional banks that did a wonderful job and truly stepped up during this time compared to the national ones. And hopefully that helps people reassess how important a local bank is to them. We take it very seriously. Our CEO was having meetings with us multiple times a day before this loan process passed, and said this is our time to step up, and we need to make sure that we're there for people. So you got to pick up the phone and have that relationship, and hopefully you find the right bank. But I know many banks within St. Louis that are based here did a wonderful job. So hope people will recognize that.
Can you explain, for those who might not know, working capital loans, interest-only loans? Can you just briefly explain what those are and the benefit of them?
Yeah, I mean, the working capital you see, whether it's through the SBA 7A program or different owners actually own their buildings. What we're doing is we're trying to offer a lower interest rate working capital loan for a 5-year interest only period to help inject some capital for these restaurants. The 2 years is just not going to be enough. if you're having to amortize that. So that's what we're working with. We're working with landlords to put them on interest only, and at times even have to defer as if they're a hotel owner and the revenue's gone to absolutely nothing. Then what good is it for a bank to take that back? So it's just picking up the phone. The banks, it's important for the bank to work with those landlords as well as their tenants. So we've made deferments and interest only, and we'll continue to assess that on a case by case basis.
Yeah. Well, and that dovetails really beautifully into talking with Tom about, Tom, obviously an attorney, you specialize in working with distressed small businesses. And one of the things that we talked about when we chatted was the importance, again, of getting ahead of this and having essentially informal negotiations with your landlord, with your bank before things get too far. Can you speak to that as well?
Sure. I think Chris raised a lot of, really good points, and I appreciate everything that he and his bank are doing for the community, because it sounds like, they're going above and beyond. Unfortunately, not every, lender in the region or nationally, as he said, is really doing that. I think especially for, people in the restaurant industry, you need to be vocal with your lenders and explain how, your restaurant and how it works and how reopening is going to work and all these different scenarios. And put forth as many possible solutions as you can, because frankly they're not going to be the creative ones. You need to come up with how you see it could work and put out all these different alternatives and see if it's something that could work. As Chris said, you can try and get deferments or long-term lease amendments or loan modifications or short-term forbearances. But for the most part, the banks are not going to be reaching out to you to ask what you need. It's on you to step up and do it. That having been said, just touching on those, kind of as Gerard said earlier, make sure you read all the fine print and everything that you're signing. Even some of the simplest agreements that you're signing are, acknowledging defaults, saying that you're not going to sue your lender or your landlord based upon entering into this new agreement. Or just some stuff that you may not understand and may need to get an attorney or an accountant or someone to help you walk through.
Yeah. So we're talking about obviously getting ahead of things, but if someone is stuck in a situation where they do need to file Chapter 11, there are some new terms. There's a kind of talk about the new approach. There's a small business Chapter 11 that is relatively new. Can you talk about that? Sure.
So everyone's heard of bankruptcy, but I think everyone has a different idea of what bankruptcy is. A lot of people are familiar with Chapter 7 and Chapter 13 bankruptcy that individuals file, where they may have a lot of medical debt or credit card debt or just some sort of consumer debt, or possibly a failed business that they're trying to get out of guarantees. Chapter 11 traditionally is filed by businesses to either, reorganize the business in full, streamline it into a more profitable business, or sell the business through bankruptcy. Chapter 11, everyone agrees, has been way too expensive for small businesses since it's been around, and small businesses have been held to the same standards as large businesses throughout that process. So this past August, and coincidentally went into effect in February, is the Small Business Reorganization Act of 2019. And the goal of that act is to try and make the Chapter 11 process more efficient, more cost effective for small businesses. And it has some provisions in it that I think I would never go as far as say bankruptcy is attractive, but it makes it more stomachable for a small business owner. And by that, I mean, under the traditional Chapter 11, you have to understand in bankruptcy, there are different priorities of debts. You have your secured debts, your banks, priority debts of taxes, your general unsecured debts, such as, vendors, credit card debts. And then below that, you have equity, the ownership interest. So under the traditional model of Chapter 11, if ownership wants to maintain their interest in the company, all the people ahead of them on the waterfall have to be paid in full. There were some exceptions to that you can litigate, but they usually involve the owner putting in additional capital just to keep their ownership interest. Under this new SBRA Chapter 11, small businesses, so long as they're willing to put in their disposable income, which is subject to case by case basis, what ordinary operating expenses are, as long as they're willing to put that in for 3 years or find a way to come up with what 3 years would be through a payment, then ownership gets to retain their interest. So I think that's very attractive. And under this new act, the eligibility for small businesses is 2.7 million in debt gross, not including insider debt. So nothing that owners or affiliates have put in. But the CARES Act upped that act to 7.5 million, not including insider debt. So I think that makes it really attractive. But again, talking about how this new act kind of plays with that waterfall under the traditional, Chapter 11 context, why do some businesses go into Chapter 11? It's because the way the bankruptcy code treats leases. So let's say I have a unfavorable lease that I want to get out of. So the bankruptcy code gives you 120 days to decide whether you want to assume or reject that lease. Let's say for 3 months prior to filing bankruptcy, you hadn't paid your rent. So if you want to keep that lease, you have 120 days to decide whether you want to assume the lease and maintain the terms or reject the lease and breach it. And if you decide to breach it, that breach becomes a general unsecured claim. And it's not a claim for the full amount of the lease. It's a formula that I think is the greater of 1 year of the lease or 15% of the lease term capped at 3 years. So that becomes a general unsecured claim. So under the new SBRA, instead of having to pay that rejected lease term in full, now small businesses have the opportunity to pay a fraction of that, so long as their disposable income makes sense. Just touching on the lease issue as well. Again, with all this uncertainty on when to open and negotiations with landlords on how it's going to work, I mean, I think it's inevitable that at some time, as Chris said, landlords have lenders too. These negotiations will break down and landlords will say, we can't do it. So again, worst case scenario, Chapter 11 might give you that opportunity to buy more time to see if this is a lease that works for you or not. And recently one bankruptcy judge out in, I want to say Virginia, wherever Pier 1 filed, went as far to say that despite the fact that Chapter 11 says you have to stay current on your post-bankruptcy rent, he went ahead and deferred it just based upon COVID and allowed them to not even have to pay post-petition obligations, which is a statutory obligation. So I just think with the way, as everyone on this panel has said, restaurants are going to have to be flexible or create new business models or their space and things are going to work and not work. I think this new Chapter 11 subchapter might offer some flexibility to kind of, see what scenarios might work and might not work.
Absolutely. So before we turn to Peter, who is going to give us some ideas of ways to pivot, I do want to pose to you a question that one of the folks watching the panel asked earlier. What about, and I know that this isn't necessarily your area of law, but what about liability if a customer were to fall ill, if an employee were to get sick while they're working, maybe if somebody even passes away, what kind of liability is there for the restaurant owner in a situation like that?
Well, I think it's especially, something that restaurant businesses are worrying about, but all businesses are worrying about this. And there is a lot of talk, lobbying and potential legislation going on to see if this could be limited in full or limited in part. But, as everyone has said, all this legislation keeps going up and down and interpreted different ways. So that it remains to be seen what happens with that. As far as the customer getting sick, I think it'd be pretty hard to prove, that someone got sick from your restaurant. I mean, we don't have the tracing and all the different protocols that some of the other countries have to be able to say someone went from point B and trace them for a whole month period as to every step that they took to say, look, they only left their house once and went to one restaurant and had no other contact with any people. So I think that's a little difficult. And as far as employees, I have heard of employees filing workers' comp claims for it. I think maybe in the Kansas City area, I haven't heard of anything around here. But again, it's not really my wheelhouse. That's just kind of a high level view of what I've seen.
So reach out to your attorney for guidance on that, I would say.
I reach out to someone who specializes in employment.
Sure, absolutely. So Peter, I think it's about time that maybe we lighten up the conversation a little bit. So Peter, really, when he and I were talking, one of the things that he specializes in is strategy and helping people to work through their ideas. And so one of the things we talked about was kind of modeling the different risks that you're facing and how to be on the defense as opposed to the offense.
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it. So let me see if I can kind of pull this up. And Kat, let me know if you can see the screen in front of you in a second. You getting any success right there?
Yep.
Okay,
Absolutely.
cool. So yeah, I don't want to minimize anything that's been said here. In fact, I think every organization has to be thinking really clearly about the defensive strategy, right? So in higher education, we're thinking about that quite a bit right now in terms of what it looks like to be able to essentially stop the bleeding financially and move everyone online for short periods of time for classes. But also at the same point, we have to be thinking about what the future of higher ed looks like. And I think the same is true with restaurants. And again, you could take this to every single industry. There's the defensive strategy, which is stopping the bleeding, preventing another attack, preparing yourself for future outbreaks, which by all means you have to do and should be doing it. And I think Gerard outlined a number of different things at the restaurant level that are right in that alley. The second part of the story, though, is saying, how do you move towards a level of offense, thinking creatively around what the future of this particular sector could look like? And so I want to just highlight a few quick things to maybe spur your thinking about how I, as a person who kind of exists in the strategy world, as well as the organizational side, might approach something like this. And because of the fact that I'm dealing with a restaurant panel and a bunch of people that are in the panel, the restaurant space that are listening in, I had to do something that was food related for my analogy. So I think of it as basically being the need to kind of project forward what your future restaurant looks like, what it looks like to essentially innovate, to be able to think creatively about running some new experiments around what your model could look like, and then to experiment, to test those experiments. So there you go. There's my pie analogy. It's the only thing I can do food-wise here today. And my wife, Kelly, will tell you that she would not want to see a real pie. She would take maybe a pie like this, but not anything in the real space. So let me see if I can kind of walk it through those three different areas. And then I know shortly we're going to open up to some questions that the group has, or that those of you listening might have for the group as a whole. So what do I mean by project? This is a little bit of that difference between backward looking financially as well as forward looking. All right, so you can look at, let's say, the normal period, and Gerard gave some good examples around what normal looks like for their different restaurants. And you could start to say, here's what our sales are, and here's what our food and labor costs are, and everything else that goes into it, whether it's insurance or other sorts of things that are in that space, marketing. And then, if we look at a typical restaurant, right, if you look across the sector, that means it leaves you about 4 or 5%, right? This is not a high margin industry, at least in most of the sectors that we all play in, right? So you know what normal looks like. And then all of a sudden you entered into this space where all of a sudden you're shut down and your restaurant drastically changes in terms of what the operations look like. And so maybe your sales dip to 25% or 20 or 15%, maybe for a period is down to 0 because you weren't doing any sort of food sales. Your costs might not dip as quickly, right? Especially with some of those fixed costs like rent and the like. And if you're trying to think creatively about how to keep staff on, I know that many restaurants were wrestling with that at the very front end. Do we lay people off? Do we furlough? Do we keep them on payroll? You're in this situation where you're trying to deal with a limitation around the money in compared to your costs. And maybe PPP fills part of that need, maybe gives you an additional source of revenue for a period of time. But in a situation like that, you're dealing with cash strain. And so in a lot of ways, restaurants are starting to think about different ways of framing their financials, not just how do we do this month, but how long can we last, right? Startups oftentimes think of this in the concept of burn rates, right? You just got $1 million or $10 million or $100 million of capital. How long will that last you? And in the case of restaurants, many restaurants are having to rethink their approach towards the financials. Now, you might be another restaurant, which is in a situation where maybe for this particular period of time, because your sales were up and you've got this forgivable grant, maybe you're able to build up some level of cash buffer. I know some restaurants are there. Well, you have to be thinking about the future as well, though. So even if you're getting some sort of cash buffer, not just a drain in this case, you want to be thinking about how long that'll last you moving forward. Because when you go to this reopen space, right, you got to now start to say, what does it look like to run our operations afresh? Maybe we can do some different things with food costs to drive that down. Maybe we have to project forward a restaurant future that is limited on meat or meat supply. All of those things have this new reality. And you might now be dealing with a limitation of sales. Niche could have 40 people. Now it's down to 10. Pastaria has a certain number. Now it's down to half or a quarter of that number. And so you're playing around with these different models of sales. Right, here's our traditional business. And now we're trying to think about what's this alternative takeout or carry out or make at home model as well. And again, I think the creative thing that people have to think about in this projecting framework is to start to kind of ask some if then questions, right? What if 25% of my staff wants to stay home because unemployment benefits are great? Or what if my takeout business that I started starts to cannibalize my real business, right? People might like going out and getting their peacemaker out in the restaurant and taking it home, and they might be a little bit nervous going back to normal. Or what if maybe people are less likely to order drinks, right? We know that extra margin is something that people feel comfortable about when the economy is good, and people feel a little bit less comfortable about it when all of a sudden they've seen a couple friends lose their jobs. So these are a couple of the questions, right? What if people go out, but not with friends, but just as couples? These are the things that you want to start to project forward a little bit more and to be kind of creative around what that model looks like. So that's my P. Let me take you through the next two really quickly, and then I'll stop talking. Us professors are used to talking for an hour and a half at a time, so I'll be brief here. So when it comes to innovating, I think you want to think about what are the dimensions for you to innovate. So I'm going to go just briefly to how a strategist might think about this. They might look at this model and start to say, well, we can innovate in terms of maybe our customer intimacy. How good are we with our customer relationships? Or the product or service innovation. I can't get food like I get at Sardella, for example. Or maybe it's operational excellence. You are just incredibly good at not throwing out that milk or using all the meat that you purchase. And for a lot of restaurants, the key thing is you need to be able to find ways to be a market leader on one of those dimensions. And by market, I mean like in your town, in your city. Are you known as being the best for one of these dimensions? And restaurants that do all of them pretty good, but not great, are not going to be able to thrive in this new reality. So start thinking about what your differentiator might be, right? Is it around product innovation, product or service innovation? Is it maybe around your customer relationships and the intimacy of those customer relationships? Good example of this is I got a small little card from the Nashin family, and it came and was a little Sydney Street card that said, many thanks to you for your willingness to go to Sydney Street during this time. Many thanks from the Nashin family and Sydney Street family more broadly. Right? That's a move towards customer intimacy that maybe at the margin makes me more likely to go back to Sydney once they reopen. So again, be thinking about what your product might look like in this new space. Maybe constraints around meat supply makes you think about some more vegetarian forward dishes that might have different forms of margin. Maybe you want to think about this as being a great time to be able to relook at all the food waste that you've had in the past and say we were able to get away with this when there was a little bit more fats, and now we have to kind of pull this back and be really efficient about how we're projecting forward our purchasing. Or maybe it's something around this customer intimacy piece, like I just mentioned there with Kevin. So you go from projecting, you start to think about innovation, and then finally, the social scientist in me cannot end without talking about these experiments that you might be able to run as well. And so imagine you've got some ideas. You've got some ideas around what it is that might actually drive some intimacy, or maybe some fear, right? So Gerard talked about a few things that they're doing creatively in the restaurant. And maybe it's fear around, will people want to come if everyone's in mass, right? These are really interesting social scientific questions that you can start to run some tests on it, right? And so what does it look like? You're going to come up with a guess. You're going to come up with a hypothesis around what you think might change about the industry. I'll give you just one brief example on this. I went the other day to Louis, and I picked up a great meal there right on Damon. And at the very tail end, they came back and they said, hey, would you like some extra bread? Because we got some bread here at the end of the day. And so they brought it out. I don't think that was at all an experiment. I don't think they were doing an A/B test and seeing exactly how guests remembered that. But that might actually be a way to start to run these little tests. What if we did give a little extra bread to our customers? What does that do in terms of their likelihood to return? What if we did send a card out to people? What does that do to their likelihood of tipping more the next time they're through? So you had these hypotheses. You might be able to run really small tests. So for example, to look back at the data and to say the people that are buying takeout, are they also more likely or less likely to go to our restaurant when we reopen, right? That's a great question to be able to start to test. And then again, test and assess, see what the data looks like. And finally, the best things that you have moving forward, find ways to scale them up and ramp them up. We are doing that right now in higher education. We got a bunch of professors that are experimenting with different ways of running classrooms. And we're all trying to think creatively about what works, what doesn't, and what does that imply, not just about this semester, but also about the fall for WashU or the following years as education continues to be disrupted from different spaces. So if there's any sort of takeaway that I would do is I would stop looking only back historically at accounting, start to project forward creatively. Think about what ways that you might want to innovate, and don't try all three at once, but say, we're going to be really good at operational excellence, or we're going to be really good at customer intimacy. And then finally, think of some small experiments that you might run right now before you open, or perhaps as you start to move forward into this next phase. What can you do to test out certain interventions, see which ones work better, and then all of a sudden scale up all that works?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge for everyone is to find opportunity in this very disrupted time. And disruption always creates up some kind of opportunity, but you have to be able to put aside the panic and be able, like you're saying, to see what your strengths are and be able to kind of put things into categories. Kind of like, distilleries are suddenly making hand sanitizer and they can't keep it in stock because they're, everybody wants it. It's that pivot that I think a lot of people are just, it's like they have cement on their feet. They're scared to death. They don't know what to do.
Yeah, and Kat, the one thing that I'll highlight here before I know we open it up to some questions and some dialogue is I think it's important to think of these as incredibly low cost experiments, right? This is not a time for massive quote unquote R&D budgets or big spends on big experiments. It's things like, what if we sent thank you notes? What if we did this? If you have multiple restaurants, we did this approach in this restaurant, but waited to be able to roll it out in a second restaurant and seeing the difference in terms of how customers respond. So think of, again, really simple, light mini tests that you can do and take advantage of your staff. Give them some creative outlets. One thing that we do know from a people standpoint is many people like to be stretched. And so if you give them an opportunity to say, here's something new we're thinking about, right? I know Gerard from the very front end was identifying that, of getting some people to look at other countries that were ahead in terms of kind of what happened to them virus-wise and what happens when they come back online. Give people some creative challenges and find ways to, again, run free experiments to be able to see what actually works.
Yeah. So we have about 10 minutes left. And we do have some questions that have come in, and there is, those of you who are watching, there is a dialogue box down below the screen where you can type in some questions if you have any. So feel free to jump in. But one question, which I thought was an interesting one, Dan and DePere, and maybe Gerard and Bob, you might know the answer to this. Is there truly a beef shortage? But beyond that, from a supply chain situation, what's happening in the restaurant industry? Are costs up? Are you able to get the product that you need? What's happening with that?
I mean, as far as supply chain and everything, I would just kind of encourage everybody to seek out, I think some farmers markets, I think Tower Grove Farmers Market's about to open. And, a lot of these farmers have actually shifted to customer deliveries and things like that. Marshall Family Farms, for one, is growing amazing stuff and, has beautiful farm eggs and things like that. I know, Bolliard's butcher shop, the butchery, like here's a lot of places to get kind of local beef, that may not be in shortage, because I think a lot of these shortages are caused by a lot of the huge meat processing facilities like Smithfield and like all these, much larger companies. So I think a lot of these small guys, although I think there has been some strain on things like local slaughterhouses and stuff like that. But I think overall, there's far more access to all this stuff. And I would also encourage, consumers and restaurants to start thinking about, that whole nose to tail thing that kind of, seems to have disappeared a little bit. But, I'm cooking a lot of oxtail. I just ordered a beef tongue from Bolyard. So cook some different stuff and try some new things, because there's a lot of delicious parts to the animal. For instance, beef navel acts just like, I know, right? Acts just like short ribs, if not better in a lot of ways. And you can get that from a lot of your butchers. So
I never thought about a cow's navel before, so that's something to think about. No, it's actually interesting that you bring that up, because one of the things just nationally that we're seeing is that there is a lot of pressure on the supply chain, but that's because of the industrial nature of the supply chain. When we really focus on making it more local and regional and closer, not only do the dollars stay in our communities because you're paying the farmer, you're paying the local market. It is something that there's a lot more control over the quality. There are a lot of things that I think are shifting people to looking at sourcing more locally. Bob, are you seeing that across the state? Oh, you're muted.
Our restaurants are telling us from their traditional supply chains, they're having trouble getting exactly the cuts they want in exactly the quantities they want. So yes, it is an issue for dairy as well.
Yeah, well, dairy's been having issues for a long time. So here's another question, which I thought was an interesting one. We've been talking a lot about the front of the house and, the fact that they're wearing masks and what should customers be doing, but the dishwasher is kind of like the front line and one of the most critical people in the restaurant that no one really ever sees. How can you protect the dishwashers in this situation when they're essentially touching everything that's been in the restaurant? Any guidance on that?
I mean, I guess I'll try to pick that one up, but I think in the same ways as before, lots of hand washing, lots of use of gloves and face masks, and constant changing of gloves, constant hand washing, again, sanitizing areas really, really well on a half-hour basis. As much of that is humanly possible.
Yeah. Bob, do you have any insight after talking with the governor? Does the state have any guidance on dishwashers?
I mean, consistent with other back of the house, the most effective thing probably is distancing as much as practical, but frequent hand washing, doubling down on disinfecting at the end of the shift. I know a lot of restaurants are having professional companies come in 2 to 3 times a week and disinfect everything while the restaurant's closed. So everything you can do in that regard helps. So
we just got another question on the to-go cocktail situation. I know that it's something that I've seen a lot on social. Bob, you mentioned when we first started that you are working to make it permanent. Can you kind of give a little bit more detail on, number one, for people who are watching who might not know what, being able to sell cocktails to go means for the bottom line of a restaurant, but then also what you're trying to push through from a legislative standpoint?
Historically, restaurants could sell liquor to go. For instance, beer and wine, if it was in its original package. So we spoke with the governor to help throw a lifeline to restaurants, issue an executive order that suspended that for a period of time and allowed restaurants, as long as they were sold in tamper-proof containers and were were sold with a food order. Same open container laws apply, same ID of the purchaser, et cetera, that they could sell cocktails to go. And a lot of restaurants, even around St. Louis especially, it seems like, have really built a clientele based on specialty cocktails. And the customers wanted it, and they have responded to our survey. As I mentioned, 75% said we would absolutely purchase if that were made available on a permanent basis. So we're trying to get that into law. The session gavels out this afternoon. So this is absolutely the last day of the 2020 session. And for a lot of the time, Capitol has been shut down. So it's hard to pass a law when the legislators aren't there. So maybe text, we're still working very hard with the Capitol lobby team.
Can I ask you a question? Speaking of that, because there's been a lot of talk about a lot of the people who are lobbying against this. Can you talk to that just a little bit? Like, I know Total Wine was brought up as one of the people lobbying against, and there were a few other unions as well.
The Beer Wholesalers Association is not of this. It's our position that we're not trying to gain a market share that we didn't have before. We're trying to, just in the way of a lifeline to restaurants, preserve just a small part of what we had before. If you look at the responsible consumption of alcohol, that space is big enough for all of us. And we don't need to try to limit one other space. We're all in this together.
We did also, I think a lot of folks are confused about PPP loans. Again, I think Chris, you were the one who was saying we aren't even sure what the terms were. Can you just give some general guidance on where people can find information on the rules surrounding PPP? Because like Gerard, when you and I were talking, you were saying that you were concerned that some people are going to see this as kind of like, cheap money. And then they're going to end up in a situation later where you're stuck with this loan. And then now you have to pay it back. It's not forgivable. So can you give some guidance on that?
Yeah, the best place is just the Treasury website. I believe it's treasury.gov. When they issue their interim guidance, they're constantly updating it on that website. Gerard's correct. A lot of people that are applying are viewing it as, oh, well, if it's not forgiven, it's only a 1% loan. And unfortunately, those people are going to probably be the ones that get hurt the most with that mindset, because that 2-year payback is going to be pretty quick. But yeah, it's constantly changing still. This week, there was new interim guidance. So I just got another email asking if like retirement plans were included, and this person was a first round applicant. So it seems like people are still confused even from back in March. So, but yeah, the Treasury website is by far the best. And hopefully people, if they're wanting a 1% loan, hopefully they'll look to longer term options and make sure they talk with their accountants and business plans to make sure it works for them.
Yeah, one thing I'll just frame in there briefly. I do find that those Q&As that are put out are actually quite helpful. So if you go to that same website, don't focus on the 370-page document, but the Q&As are actually quite helpful. And honestly, I think you just need to start to run the numbers with your own restaurant, right? So you see this 75% amount that has to go to labor, and it's one thing to think about that, but then all of a sudden you start to kind of lay it out with your own restaurants and to say, well, what was our payroll last month and what was it moving forward and how many do we think we're going to be able to get back? That's really the only way that you can get to a realistic estimate of how much is forgivable versus how much is in this loan structure. So you really have to start to get comfortable with the spreadsheet for a little bit and start to map it out.
Yeah, and I would say too that the CARES Act, in terms of a congressional law of 800 some pages, was drafted very quickly. And the SBA was in a matter of 14 days, did about 14 years worth of loans. The banks, the local banks, they called upon them and they stepped in, but even the local banks didn't have the guidance that they needed, at least initially. Hopefully that's improved. But the thing that we're waiting on, and I agree, the Treasury has issued guidance on this through a series of frequently asked questions, which people like us probably checked several times a day. The one thing we're really looking at is what does partial forgiveness look like? And what we really need for this program to benefit the industry, especially any industry where your business was shut down during your 8-week period, is to extend the time. That's a very simple fix that's consistent with the intent of Congress. And we hope that we see something like that forthcoming very soon.
Fantastic. Well, we are at 11:01. We are 1 minute over, which I think is pretty good in terms of timing. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this conversation. I think it's been really enlightening and helpful. I really appreciate your time, and I know that everyone who's been watching. Again, we're going to be we've been recording this. It's going to be saved and archived so that anybody can go back and listen to this again. We'll also have your contact information available if folks want to reach out. Chris and Tom, Bob, Gerard, Peter, thank you very much. And please stay safe out there, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks, Kat. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kat.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.